The morning sun was just beginning to stretch across the quiet village, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The marketplace was already alive with chatter, merchants calling out their prices, children running barefoot, and neighbors trading gossip over baskets of fresh fruit. In the middle of this busy hum, one figure caught everyone's attention. A man walked slowly, not with a horse, not with a cart, but with a donkey that looked tired, stubborn, and out of place. People turned their heads, whispering and pointing. Some shook their heads with disbelief, others smirked. A few couldn't hold back their laughter. To them it was ridiculous. Who would choose a donkey of all animals to carry his dreams forward? The laughter began small, a couple of chuckles here and there, but soon it rippled through the crowd like a wave. Traders leaned against their stalls, shaking with amusement. Children pointed with wide grins, mimicking the donkey's awkward steps. Even a few elders, who usually carried dignity in their silence, smiled knowingly, as if they had already decided what the outcome of this story would be. In their eyes, the man was foolish, and the donkey was proof of it. After all, in a world where appearances mattered, who dared to arrive with something so ordinary, so unimpressive? But the man did not flinch. His pace never changed. His gaze stayed fixed on the path ahead, though he surely heard the whispers and laughter all around him. His hands rested lightly on the donkey's reins, and if you looked closely, there was something in his expression that wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't fear either. It was something else, something harder to define, like quiet certainty. Still, to the crowd, he looked like nothing more than the punchline of a cruel joke. What they didn't know was that behind that dusty path and beyond the laughter, something unexpected was about to unfold. The donkey, underestimated and mocked, would become the very key to a story none of them could have predicted. But at that moment, all anyone could see was a man too stubborn to realize he was being ridiculed. Some of the villagers started shouting comments, each one sharper than the last. "Did your horse run away?" one called out. "Why don't you borrow a real animal?" another jeered. The sound of laughter bounced off the stone walls of the market, louder and louder, as though the entire village was in on the joke. Yet, the man remained calm, each step measured, his donkey plodding beside him with steady rhythm. It was human nature, wasn't it? To laugh at what we don't understand, to mock what doesn't fit the picture we expect. In that moment, they weren't just laughing at a donkey. They were laughing at determination they couldn't see, at resilience they didn't recognize. They were laughing at possibility disguised in the simplest of forms. A few stood quietly in the back of the crowd, not joining in the mockery but watching with curiosity. Something about the way the man carried himself didn't match the story. Everyone else was writing about him. He wasn't lowering his head in shame nor quickening his pace to escape the taunts. If anything, he walked as though the laughter were nothing more than passing noise, as though he knew something they did not. The donkey, too, seemed unfazed. Its ears twitched at the noise, but its steady gait never faltered. Every step on the cobblestones was a reminder that sometimes strength is not about speed or beauty or grandeur. Sometimes it is about endurance, the quiet ability to keep moving forward when the world expects you to stop. Still, the villagers couldn't imagine that such a humble sight could hold any weight. In their minds, success always arrived with noise and display. Horses with shining coats, carts filled with riches, men wearing pride on their sleeves. A man and a donkey? That was only a story meant to end in failure, or so they believed. But life often turns stories upside down when we least expect it. The laughter of the crowd would soon give way to silence. Their disbelief would soon turn to awe, and the very donkey they mocked would prove to be more valuable than the strongest horse or the fanciest cart. As the man reached the center of the square, the noise swelled again, echoing through the walls of the village. His steps slowed for the first time, and he looked up at the gathering crowd. For a brief second, the marketplace held its breath. Something in his eyes shifted, a spark of quiet defiance that no one could ignore. What happened next would not only silence their laughter, but also leave a mark on their hearts that they would never forget. The donkey that everyone ridiculed, the man that everyone underestimated, were about to change everything in a way no one saw coming. And in that moment, Before the turn of events unfolded, the village stood divided. Some laughed harder, certain they would soon be proven right. Others leaned forward, sensing that maybe, just maybe, the joke wasn't on the man after all. The truth lingered in the air, just beyond reach, waiting to reveal itself. The laughter was loud, the mockery relentless, but destiny was about to whisper something entirely different. What followed next would shock everyone who stood there that morning, and none of them would ever look at a donkey or the man leading it the same way again. The man held the reins loosely, his eyes fixed ahead as though he was following a path only he could see. The donkey moved at the same steady pace, its hooves clicking softly on the stones of the market square. People expected him to stop, to falter, or to explain himself, but he offered no explanation. The silence in his manner was louder than words, and that silence unsettled more people than they cared to admit. A few whispered to each other, wondering where he had come from and why he would choose to parade through the village with an animal so ordinary when others displayed horses and carriages that reflected wealth and power. What no one knew was that his journey had begun long before that morning. He was not born into riches. His days had been marked by hard work and hands roughened by labor. Fields and hills had been his world, and the donkey was his only companion through those years of toil. The animal had carried sacks of grain, bundles of firewood, and buckets of water from the stream when no one else was there to help. It was not glamorous, and it was never meant to impress. Yet for the man, the donkey symbolized loyalty, persistence, and survival. To him, it was more than a beast of burden. It was part of his story, and he carried that story into the village whether people laughed or not. But in the eyes of the villagers, appearances mattered more than history. They remembered tales of men who rode in with fine horses, their saddles decorated with leather and gold, their voices strong and commanding. Those were the men who were taken seriously, who were believed to have vision and strength. So when they saw this man, with plain clothes and a donkey with a dusty coat, their minds had already been made up. They thought they knew the ending, before the first page of his story was even read. Still, there was something about him that resisted their judgment. He carried himself with calm that no amount of laughter could shake. It was not arrogance, but a quiet kind of belief that seemed to settle deep within his bones. And while most continued to mock, a handful of people began to wonder, why wasn't he reacting? Why didn't he turn away in shame or rush to defend himself? What gave him the strength to keep moving as though the noise around him were nothing more than wind against his back? Whispers began to shift from ridicule to curiosity. Some recalled seeing him outside the village, walking the hills alone, always with his donkey. They said he worked harder than most, never stopping even when others rested. Others claimed he often gave away what little he had, sharing bread or water with travelers who passed through. The stories conflicted, but they all painted the picture of a man who lived differently, who carried values not often seen in a world driven by pride and possessions. The donkey itself became a symbol of the mystery. To the crowd, it looked unimpressive, its steps heavy and unhurried, its coat faded by sun and dust. But if one looked closely, its eyes told another story. They held patience, the kind that comes only from years of enduring without complaint. It was as though the animal understood the mockery but refused to be broken by it. There was strength in that patience, and though few noticed it in that moment, it would later be remembered. The tension in the air grew thicker. The villagers couldn't decide whether to continue laughing or to wait and see what this strange man intended. A few even grew uneasy, sensing that their own ridicule might turn back on them. After all, what if the man was leading the donkey towards something greater, something none of them had anticipated? Their laughter would echo differently then. Still, the jeers did not stop. Some pushed closer, testing him with words sharper than before. They wanted to see if he would finally break, if the weight of ridicule would force him to stumble. But he did not stumble. He walked on, step after step, as though each stone beneath his feet was guiding him toward a truth hidden just beyond the square. The man's silence began to gnaw at them. Why wouldn't he speak? Why wouldn't he explain himself? Most men, when mocked, fought back or at least tried to justify their choices. But his refusal to defend himself made their laughter feel weaker. It made them question why they cared so much about a donkey in the first place. And so the conflict deepened, not only in the marketplace but within each person watching. On the surface, it was a simple scene: a man, a donkey, and a laughing crowd. But underneath, it was something more. It was a test of pride against humility, of appearances against substance, of noise against silence. Each villager felt it differently, but none could ignore it completely. The man's past was not widely known, but his presence carried the weight of it. Years of being overlooked had shaped him, teaching him to trust in patience rather than approval. Where others sought recognition, he sought endurance. Where others measured success by gold or applause, he measured it by the quiet victories of survival and resilience. The donkey had been with him through those silent victories, and to abandon it now for the sake of appearances would have betrayed everything he had learned. And yet, the village did not understand. They saw only what was before them, not the years behind it. They did not see the long days under the burning sun, or the nights spent by the dim glow of fire when food was scarce. They did not see the times when the donkey was the only steady companion, carrying burdens that would have broken the man alone. Instead, they saw a joke, and they laughed. But every laugh carried them closer to the moment when their assumptions would shatter. The man's quiet defiance was leading them to a truth that would demand silence. The donkey's slow steps were not meaningless. They were steps toward revelation. As the man moved past the heart of the marketplace, a hush began to fall over parts of the crowd. The laughter, though still present, was no longer as loud. It sounded strained, as though some no longer believed in it. The sight before them was becoming harder to mock. The longer he walked without breaking, the more it seemed that the joke was not on him at all. In that silence, questions began to grow. Who was this man really? What was he about to do? Why bring a donkey here, into the eyes of all, if not for a reason that none of them had guessed? The air itself seemed to tighten, as though the village was caught between two truths: what they thought they knew and what was about to be revealed. No one could yet imagine how the donkey would play its part, but deep down, even the loudest voices began to sense it. Something was coming, something no amount of laughter could stop. And though the man still said nothing, his silence was no longer empty. It was full of weight, full of a promise that the moment they thought they understood was only the beginning of something much larger. The donkey walked on, steady and unshaken, carrying not only its master's burdens but also the suspense of an entire village waiting for what would happen next. And with every step, the laughter that had filled the square began to sound less certain, less like truth, and more like fear of what they did not yet understand. The marketplace had become more than just a place of trade that morning. It had turned into a stage, and every villager was both actor and audience. The man with the donkey was at the center of it all, drawing eyes whether people wanted to admit it or not. The air was heavy with expectation, though no one could say exactly what they were waiting for. The laughter still hung in pockets of the crowd, but beneath it was a growing restlessness. The man had not faltered, and that alone made people uneasy. If he was as foolish as they believed, why didn't he break under their ridicule? Why did he keep walking with that same quiet confidence, as if every step carried him closer to something only he could see? In the shadows near the fruit stalls, a group of younger men whispered to each other. They had been the loudest voices earlier, mocking the donkey and shouting insults across the square. But now their laughter had thinned into nervous smirks. They began to argue among themselves. One insisted the man was wasting everyone's time, that he was nothing more than a wanderer with no sense of pride. Another wasn't so sure. He pointed out the way the man hadn't once lowered his head, hadn't once sped up his pace to escape them. "Doesn't it bother you?" he asked quietly. "It's like he knows something we don't." The others brushed it off, but the unease in their eyes betrayed them. At the same time, a cluster of older women stood by the well, their baskets of herbs and bread forgotten as they watched. Their voices were softer, not mocking but questioning. One of them remembered seeing the man years before, carrying tools across the hillside with that same donkey beside him. He worked harder than most, she recalled. I don't know his story, but he didn't strike me as a fool. Another shook her head, insisting that anyone serious would have arrived with something stronger, something worthy of respect. Yet even she couldn't explain the steadiness in his stride, the way he seemed untouched by the storm of judgment swirling around him. The donkey itself had become a strange presence in the story. Its hooves struck the cobblestones with a rhythm that seemed to cut through the noise. It didn't stumble, didn't shy away, didn't bray in protest. To some, it was just a stubborn beast, unaware of the laughter it caused. But to others, it was starting to look like something more. An animal so humble, so ordinary, yet walking with the kind of patience that mirrored its master's silence. Its presence forced people to question why they were laughing in the first place. Was it truly the donkey that amused them? Or was it their own fear of being reminded that greatness doesn't always arrive dressed in grandeur? The conflict deepened as different voices rose. Some argued openly now, saying the man was a distraction, that he should leave before the market lost its order. Others defended him, claiming he had every right to walk there with his donkey, that it was no one's place to decide how another lived. The village, usually united in its routines, began to splinter into sides. The laughter had sown division, and the man's silence had watered it. Children who had once pointed and giggled grew quieter too. They sensed something in the air that even the adults couldn't name. Some of them followed at a distance, curious about where the man and donkey might go. Their innocence saw what the grown-ups missed, that the man wasn't embarrassed and maybe he wasn't meant to be. In the midst of this, a traveling merchant, who had only recently arrived in the village, leaned against his cart and studied the scene with interest. He had journeyed through many towns and seen how quickly people judged what they didn't understand. He didn't join in the laughter. Instead, he watched with the kind of sharpness that comes from years of seeing stories unfold in unexpected ways. To him, this wasn't comedy. It was the beginning of something much larger, though even he couldn't yet name it. Tension pressed harder on the crowd when the man finally slowed his pace near the steps of the old stone fountain. The villagers leaned forward, eager to see what he would do. Would he finally speak? Would he reveal the purpose of his strange procession? Whispers spread like sparks. Some insisted he would announce himself as a fool. Others claimed he was about to make a declaration that would change everything. The silence between his steps felt louder than any words he could have spoken, but he still said nothing. He simply stood beside the fountain, resting his hand gently on the donkey's neck. His calmness seemed to echo louder than the jeers. It wasn't defiance that held him upright, but a kind of peace that unsettled those who had mocked him most. For the first time, a few of them began to wonder if their laughter had been misplaced. Subplots began to weave into the conflict. The young men near the stalls, uneasy and restless, dared each other to step forward and confront him. They wanted to break the silence, to prove once and for all that he was no more than what they had decided. Yet none of them moved, as though something invisible held them back. At the same time, the older women by the well began to recall stories of their own lives, when they too had been mocked for choices that didn't fit the village's expectations. Their whispers carried a different tone now, less judgment, more recognition. Even the merchant by his cart began to sense the weight of the moment. He thought of the goods he carried, shiny trinkets that always impressed crowds at first but were forgotten soon after. He compared that to the man with the donkey, whose simplicity seemed to outshine all the polished displays. The merchant realized that appearances could capture attention, but character held it. The donkey lowered its head slightly, drinking from the fountain, and the crowd stirred again. Some laughed nervously, others fell quiet, waiting for the man to finally reveal why he had come. The scene was pulling them deeper into a story they didn't understand but couldn't walk away from. The conflict was no longer just about a donkey. It was about pride, humility, and the way people measure worth. It was about how quickly a crowd could turn someone into a spectacle, and how one person's silence could shift that spectacle into a mirror reflecting their own fears. Different angles grew sharper with every passing moment. Some villagers clung to their laughter, determined to prove themselves right, unwilling to admit the possibility of being wrong. Others leaned into curiosity, quietly waiting for the next step, and somewhere in between, many wrestled with their own doubts, caught between the comfort of mockery and the unease of wondering what truth might be hiding beneath the surface. The man's story had not yet unfolded, but already it had unsettled the village in ways no one expected. The conflict stretched far beyond the square, weaving into old grudges, hidden insecurities, and unspoken questions. People were forced to look at themselves, at the way they judged others, at the way they dismissed what seemed too simple to matter. And still, the man did not speak. His silence was heavier than words, his donkey's patience louder than noise. The tension grew with every heartbeat, as though the village itself was holding its breath. Something was coming, something no one could name yet. But it was close, enough that everyone could feel it pressing at the edges of their certainty. The laughter had started the story, but now it was no longer laughter that ruled the square. It was suspense, unrelenting and sharp, stretching across every face and whispering the same question into every heart. What was he about to reveal, and why had he chosen the donkey, of all things, to carry his message? The answer remained hidden, and the silence kept building. The crowd leaned closer, unaware that their own division and doubt were becoming part of the story itself. The man stood calmly, the donkey steady at his side, and together they held the village in the palm of their hands, without a single word spoken. The fountain's shadow stretched long across the square as the sun climbed higher, yet no one moved from their place. The man and his donkey had turned an ordinary morning into something the villagers could not walk away from. They told themselves they stayed because they wanted to laugh more, or because they were curious, or because they were waiting for a fool to trip and prove their point. But deep down, every person felt the same thing, an unease that something beyond their control was unfolding before their eyes. The donkey stood still, its breath steady, its eyes calm. The man rested one hand on its neck, as if drawing quiet strength from the animal. His silence grew heavier with each passing moment, pressing against the crowd until even the most confident mockers shifted uncomfortably. People had expected him to crumble, to defend himself, or to shout back. Instead, he had given them nothing, and that nothing had become unbearable. Whispers spread again. Some said he was a madman, others claimed he must be hiding something. A few murmured that perhaps this was a test, though no one could explain what kind of test or why it was happening here, in the heart of the marketplace. The young men by the stalls grew louder, their voices rising as if to fill the silence with noise. They dared each other to approach him, to demand an explanation, but still they hesitated. None of them wanted to be the first to step into that space to break the invisible line drawn by his calmness. Among the older women near the well, the whispers carried a different weight. They spoke of omens, of moments when simple things had revealed greater truths. One recalled a time when a poor farmer had been mocked for planting seeds in a season thought to be cursed, only for his fields to flourish while others withered. Another told of a widow who had been laughed at for keeping a lame goat, only to later discover that the animal's milk healed an illness in her child. Their voices were low, but those around them leaned in, their own doubts feeding on such stories. The merchant at his cart watched with sharp eyes, sensing profit in the air but also something he could not measure in coins. He had seen crowds turn before, seen mockery turn into awe, and he recognized the signs. The man and his donkey were no longer just a subject of ridicule. They had become a mirror, forcing the villagers to see themselves more clearly than they wanted. The merchant wondered how long it would take before the laughter collapsed under the weight of that reflection. Children, restless yet drawn in, edged closer to the fountain. They giggled at first, pointing at the donkey's twitching ears, but their laughter faded as they noticed the seriousness on their parents' faces. They sensed that this was not just a game anymore. Something important was happening, though they couldn't put it into words. The silence stretched so long that it began to feel like a rope pulled tight. Every breath, every shifting foot, every whisper made it tighter. Then, suddenly, the donkey brayed, a sound sharp and unexpected, cutting through the air like a blade. The crowd startled, some laughing nervously, others gasping as if the animal itself had spoken. The man did not flinch. He simply patted the donkey's neck, his eyes steady on the crowd. That single sound shifted the mood again. The donkey was no longer just a beast of burden. To the villagers, it seemed to carry a message, though no one could agree on what that message was. Some claimed it was a sign of foolishness, proof that the animal was as useless as they had believed. Others felt a chill, as though the donkey's voice had echoed something unspoken, something waiting just beyond their understanding. The tension mounted as arguments broke out in the square. One man shouted that the stranger should be forced to leave before he disrupted the village any further. Another argued that driving him out without knowing his purpose would be reckless. The voices grew louder, clashing like storm winds, each one trying to drown the others. Yet through it all, the man remained silent. His calmness was no longer simply unsettling. It was infuriating to some, frightening to others, and strangely, comforting to a few. His refusal to speak made his presence heavier, as though the words he held back were more powerful than anything the villagers could say. The young men by the stalls could no longer bear it. One of them stepped forward, his fists clenched, his voice raised. He demanded to know why the man had brought a donkey into the marketplace, why he had stood there so long without speaking. The crowd fell quiet, all eyes fixed on the two figures. The man looked at the youth, his expression unchanged. He did not answer. The silence stretched until the youth faltered, his voice breaking under the weight of it. He stepped back, shaken, and the crowd murmured in disbelief. It was then that another subplot began to stir. A farmer near the edge of the square who had once lost everything in a season of drought spoke up. He told the others how he had been mocked for trusting in the simplest of tools, while wealthier men had bought fancy equipment that later failed them. He said the man with the donkey reminded him of those days, of the way simplicity had saved him when pride had failed. His words carried weight, for many remembered that season, and the silence that followed was thick with memory. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some shouted that the farmer was blinded by his own bitterness, that he wanted to believe in the stranger because it justified his past. The crowd split further, arguments boiling like water about to spill over. The square no longer felt like a place of trade, but a battlefield of pride, doubt, and fear. The donkey shifted its weight, hooves scraping against stone, and the crowd stiffened again. Even the smallest movement seemed loaded with meaning now. Every sound, every gesture fed into the tension, pulling the rope tighter and tighter. People leaned forward, caught between wanting the moment to end and fearing what the end might bring. The merchant, watching closely, muttered under his breath that the man was not ordinary, that no one could hold a crowd like this without saying a single word unless they carried something greater inside them. He did not know if it was wisdom, faith, or madness, but he knew it was powerful. The square was no longer filled with laughter. It was filled with anticipation so sharp it pricked the skin. The villagers' hearts pounded with questions they couldn't voice. Who was this man? Why had he chosen this donkey? What truth lingered behind his silence? Every passing moment drew them closer to something they could feel, but not see. The conflict had stretched to its limit, pulling every thread of pride, fear, memory, and hope into a single knot. The villagers stood at the edge of something that could break them or change them, and the man stood quietly in the center, holding it all without a single word. The air itself seemed to tremble, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The donkey lifted its head from the fountain, ears flicking, as if it too sensed the weight of what was about to come. The man did not move, but his stillness carried a promise. Whatever was hidden in his silence was nearly ready to surface, and when it did, nothing in the village would ever be the same again. The moment broke not with words from the man, but with action so simple it stunned the crowd into silence. He stepped forward, guiding the donkey with a gentle tug on the rope, and began to unload a bundle that had been fastened to its back. For all their laughter, no one had noticed the weight the animal carried. Layer upon layer of cloth was unwrapped, until at last the contents were revealed. Bags of grain, fruit, jars of water, and bundles of wood. Ordinary things, yet priceless to a village that had been struggling quietly through a poor season. The square went still. Those who had mocked The donkey, for its humble appearance, now saw what it had been carrying all along. It had not been a symbol of foolishness, but of provision, of patience, of silent endurance. The man looked at the people at last, his eyes steady, and spoke only a few words. He said he had come not for recognition or pride, but to share what he had, because he remembered what it felt like to have nothing. The villagers shifted uneasily, their laughter dead in their throats. Shame washed over those who had shouted the loudest, while others who had quietly wondered about him now felt a strange relief, as though their suspicions of his purpose had been confirmed. The children edged closer, their eyes wide, not with laughter but with awe. One of the older women by the well moved forward, her hands trembling. She took one of the loaves of bread he offered and held it as though it were more than food. She turned to the others and reminded them of the stories they had once told, of how humility often carried the greatest strength. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time the sound was different. It was no longer ridicule. It was reflection. The young men who had mocked him most stood frozen, unable to meet his gaze. One of them finally lowered his head, the weight of shame heavier than any sack the donkey had ever carried. Their pride had been shattered by the quiet truth before them. The man had not come to boast, nor to prove them wrong. He had simply lived by values they had forgotten, and that truth was harder to face than any argument. The merchant by his cart stepped forward next, his eyes sharp but softer now. He admitted that he had seen many things in his travels, but never had he seen a crowd silenced so deeply by humility. He told the villagers that wealth and status fade, but what the man had brought, a lesson in patience, loyalty, and generosity, was more valuable than gold. The donkey stood quietly as all this unfolded its role complete. It had carried the weight without complaint, through laughter and insult until the truth was revealed. People began to see it differently now. It was no longer just a beast of burden. It was a symbol of resilience, of hidden strength, of the truth that what seems ordinary can often carry extraordinary purpose. As the man handed out what he had brought, one by one the villagers stepped forward. They accepted the food, the grain, the wood, not with mockery but with gratitude. And in each gift they found more than sustenance. They found a reminder of humility, of patience, of the way appearances can deceive. The laughter that had filled the square earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet reverence that bound the village together. The farmer who had spoken earlier about the drought felt tears burn his eyes as he helped distribute the grain. He turned to the others and told them that the man had shown them something more powerful than pride. He had shown them the strength of endurance. The crowd listened, and for once no one argued. Children carried small bundles home, their voices full of wonder as they spoke of the man and his donkey. To them, it was a story they would never forget. It was no longer about ridicule, but about revelation. They would grow up remembering that a man with nothing more than a humble animal had taught the entire village what true strength looked like. As the last of the gifts were given, the man looked around the square. He did not ask for thanks or recognition. He simply gave a small nod as though satisfied that what needed to be done had been done. He touched the donkey's neck once more, then began to walk away, leaving behind a village forever changed. No, one laughed now. They watched in silence as he and the donkey disappeared down the road. For a long time the marketplace remained still, each person caught in thought. Some felt shame for their cruelty, others felt relief for the lesson they had been given. But all of them knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. In the days that followed, the story spread beyond the village. Travelers carried it with them, merchants repeated it in distant towns, and soon people everywhere spoke of the man with the donkey. They spoke of how he endured laughter with silence, how he revealed strength without pride, how he gave without expecting anything in return. The story became a lesson, told to children and remembered by elders, a reminder that appearances can deceive, and that true worth lies in quiet resilience. The young men who had mocked him changed the most. They could not escape the weight of their shame, but instead of letting it destroy them, they let it shape them. They worked harder, spoke with more care, and treated others with the respect they had once denied. They carried the memory of that day as a constant reminder of who they did not want to be. The older women by the well found comfort in the story, seeing in it a reflection of their own struggles. They told it again and again, using it to teach others the value of humility and patience. And the farmer who had once been mocked found his voice respected, for people now listened more closely when he spoke of endurance. The merchant carried the story with him on his journeys, sharing it as often as he could. He found that it drew more attention than the goods he sold, and in a way it became his greatest treasure. He told it not as a tale of mystery, but as a truth he had witnessed with his own eyes, and everywhere he went, people listened. The donkey, though it remained just a humble animal, became part of the village's memory. Children played games pretending to lead donkeys through laughter, only to reveal treasures hidden on their backs. They grew up with the lesson stitched into their lives, that humility often carries more power than pride. And the man, though he never returned, lived on in the minds of those who had seen him. His silence, his strength, his generosity, they became part of the village's identity. No one forgot the day the laughter turned to awe, the day a donkey carried not only burdens, but truth itself. In the end, the story left more than just memories. It left a reflection for everyone who heard it. It reminded them to look beyond appearances, to value patience, to remember that true strength often comes quietly. It reminded them that generosity and humility can silence even the loudest ridicule. The village was never the same again. They traded goods as before, they laughed and worked and argued as people always do. But there was a difference now. There was a thread of humility woven through their lives, a thread that had been placed there by a man who walked with a donkey and never once raised his voice. And so the story closed not with laughter, but with reflection. It ended with a lesson, carried in the hearts of all who witnessed it, and in the voices of those who retold it. A lesson that true strength is not measured by pride or appearances, but by patience, resilience, and the quiet power of humility.